March 4, 1944. Berlin, Germany. Luftwaffe fighter pilots scrambled from Tempelhof airfield to intercept incoming American bomber formations. Intelligence had warned that a large raid was approaching the capital. Pilots ran to their aircraft, climbed into cockpits, and took off to meet the threat. This was routine by 1944 standards. American bombers had been conducting daylight raids over Germany for months. German pilots knew the pattern. American B-17 and B-24 bombers would approach in massive formations, accompanied by fighter escorts that would turn back when they reached their fuel limits. Then German fighters would attack the unprotected bombers. But today would be different. Today, everything would change. The escorts, usually P-47 Thunderbolts or P-38 Lightnings, had limited range. They could protect bombers to the German border, sometimes slightly beyond, but they couldn't reach deep into Germany. Once the escorts turned back, German fighters had freedom to attack bomber formations without interference. Berlin was far enough inland that bomber formations attacking the capital never had fighter escort. The distance was simply too great. American fighters couldn't fly 500-plus miles from their bases in England, engage in combat, and have enough fuel to return. The mathematics of fuel capacity and combat radius made it impossible. Or so the Germans believed. When German pilots climbed to altitude and spotted the incoming bomber formation, they expected to find what they always found over Berlin: hundreds of unescorted bombers that could be attacked without having to fight through fighter screens. Instead, they found American P-51 Mustangs flying escort at 25,000 feet. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, flying his Bf-109 G6, later wrote about that moment. "We couldn't believe what we were seeing. American fighters over Berlin. It was impossible. We knew their combat radius. We knew they didn't have the range. Yet there they were, silver P-51s flying circles around the bomber formations as if they had unlimited fuel." The German pilots' confusion was understandable. They'd calculated American fighter ranges carefully. They knew the P-47 Thunderbolt had a combat radius of approximately 375 miles with drop tanks. The P-38 Lightning could reach about 450 miles. Neither could reach Berlin from bases in England. The distance was over 600 miles one way. But what the Germans didn't know, what they had dismissed as impossible, was that P-51 Mustang could fly combat missions covering over 1,300 miles total distance. How did the Americans achieve the impossible? The answer wasn't just the aircraft. It was a combination of three revolutionary elements that came together in early 1944. First, the engine. The Merlin engine, the British Rolls-Royce power plant that replaced the original Allison engine in P-51 designs, was extraordinarily fuel efficient. This wasn't just any engine. It was manufactured by Packard under license and supercharged to produce maximum power while sipping fuel at high altitude. Combined with the P-51's sleek airframe and carefully designed fuel systems, the aircraft achieved range that no other fighter matched. But the engine alone wasn't enough. Second, disposable fuel tanks made from paper. Yes, paper. These external drop tanks, constructed from treated paper and glue, could be manufactured cheaply and quickly. They added hundreds of miles to the P-51's range, then could be jettisoned when empty or when combat began. The British and Americans had cracked the code on extending fighter range without compromising combat performance. And the tanks worked because of the third element, fuel quality. While German fighters struggled with synthetic fuel rated at 85 to 90 octane, corrosive due to high sulfur content and unable to sustain high compression ratios, the P-51s ran on 100-octane aviation fuel. This superior fuel allowed higher engine compression, more power, and crucially, better fuel efficiency at altitude. The Germans had all the puzzle pieces in front of them, but they'd never believed the Americans could put them together. German intelligence had received reports about P-51 range capabilities. Those reports were dismissed as propaganda. German aeronautical engineers had calculated that achieving such range would require impossible compromises, reduced armament, minimal armor, or performance limitations. The reports suggesting that the P-51 had long range and good performance and adequate armament were rejected as physically impossible. Now German pilots were encountering those impossible aircraft over Berlin. But here's what most people don't know. The P-51s weren't even the first American fighters to reach Berlin. The day before, March 3, 1944, P-38 Lightnings had escorted bombers to the German capital. But the P-38s were limited in numbers and couldn't sustain the effort. The P-51, however, could be produced in massive quantities and operate in any weather. What the Germans witnessed on March 4th wasn't a one-time stunt. It was the beginning of systematic destruction. But the P-51's range was only part of the equation. What truly destroyed the Luftwaffe was a change in tactics that most histories overlook. In January 1944, Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force, replacing Lieutenant General Ira Eaker. Doolittle immediately implemented a radical tactical shift that would prove more devastating than any aircraft advantage. Previously, American fighters had been ordered to stick close to bomber formations, flying tight escort, never leaving their charges. German fighters could pick their moment, attack from advantageous positions, and break off before American escorts could respond effectively. Doolittle changed everything with a single order: go after the Luftwaffe. Instead of remaining glued to bomber formations, American fighters were now unleashed. P-51s would hunt German fighters before they could reach the bombers. They would chase them back to their airfields. They would strafe planes on the ground. The mission wasn't just to protect bombers anymore. It was to destroy the Luftwaffe completely. The effect was catastrophic for Germany. Inexperienced Luftwaffe pilots, expecting to attack heavily armed but slow-moving bombers, instead found themselves ambushed by superior numbers of American fighters. Fighters whose performance, in many cases, exceeded their own aircraft. Fighters piloted by men with vastly more training than the rushed, inadequate preparation the Luftwaffe could provide by 1944. The result was inevitable. The initial engagement over Berlin on March 4th demonstrated the new reality immediately. German fighters attempting to attack the bomber formation had to fight through P-51 escorts first. The P-51s were fast, over 440 miles per hour at altitude, matching or exceeding German fighter speeds. They were maneuverable, competitive at high speeds where most combat occurred, and they were well armed. 650 caliber machine guns provided devastating firepower. More importantly, the American pilots had fuel reserves for extended combat. German fighters engaging the escorts couldn't force the Americans to break off by threatening their fuel status. The P-51s could fight over Berlin for extended periods and still have enough fuel to escort bombers home. German pilots who'd grown accustomed to attacking undefended bombers now faced a brutal choice: fight through P-51 escorts and accept heavy losses, or allow the bombers to reach their targets unmolested. Either option led to German defeat, one through pilot attrition, the other through destroyed industry. Luftwaffe Command initially hoped the March 4th mission was an anomaly. Perhaps the P-51s had used a forward staging base, or had been fitted with one-way fuel configurations, or had benefited from unusual weather conditions. These hopes collapsed when P-51 escorts appeared over Berlin again on March 6th, and again on March 8th, and again throughout March and April, and every month until the war ended. The Americans weren't conducting special one-time missions. They were running regular escorted raids to Berlin. The P-51's range wasn't a theoretical capability or propaganda claim. It was operational reality that was systematically destroying German air defense. The numbers tell the story. The 8th Air Force mission to Berlin on March 6, 1944, resulted in 69 German fighters shot down against just 11 American fighters lost. The kill ratio favored America by more than 6-1. During Big Week, February 20 to 25th, 1944, American forces lost 28 fighters while destroying 262 German fighters. The mathematics were brutal and unsustainable. German fighter pilot casualties increased dramatically. Before P-51 escorts reached Berlin, German pilots had operated with significant advantages over unescorted bombers. Now they faced well-trained American fighter pilots in aircraft that matched or exceeded German performance. The psychological impact was severe. German pilots who'd once had confidence in their ability to defend German airspace now faced opponents they couldn't reliably defeat. Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters for the Luftwaffe, later wrote, The day I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. We'd lost air superiority. Our strategy of waiting for escorts to turn back before attacking bombers was finished. The Americans could now protect their bombers anywhere in Germany, and there was nothing we could do about it. Germany couldn't replace experienced pilots at the rate they were being lost. Pilot training programs required months to produce competent pilots and years to produce veterans. American pilot training programs were producing thousands of pilots annually, with hundreds of flight hours before they ever saw combat. German training programs, constrained by fuel shortages and compressed timelines, were producing pilots with minimal preparation. By spring 1944, the average German fighter pilot had significantly less training than the average American pilot. German replacements sometimes had under 100 hours of total flight time, barely enough to operate the aircraft safely, much less engage in combat against experienced opponents. Major Georg Peter Eder, a Luftwaffe ace who survived the war, described the situation. By mid-1944, we were sending boys into combat against men. Our replacements didn't have the training or experience to survive. They'd last one mission, maybe two, then they were gone. We couldn't maintain pilot quality when we were losing experienced men faster than we could train replacements. The P-51's impact extended beyond direct combat into a vicious cycle that Germany couldn't escape. German fighters that had previously been stationed near potential targets now had to be positioned to intercept bomber formations earlier and farther west, hoping to engage before bombers reached their targets. This meant German fighters were burning precious fuel reaching interception points, then fighting P-51 escorts, then potentially pursuing bombers, all while the Americans had fuel reserves from their superior range and superior fuel quality. German pilots increasingly found themselves running low on fuel during engagements. They'd have to break off combat, not because they were losing, but because continuing would mean running out of fuel before reaching base. American pilots, with the P-51's fuel reserves and 100-octane gas, could press engagements, knowing they had margins that German fighters lacked. The strategic bombing campaign that had been costly and uncertain in 1943 became devastatingly effective in 1944, once P-51 escorts could reach any target in Germany. American bomber losses dropped dramatically. Missions that previously experienced 5 to 10% losses now saw losses under 2%. The protection P-51 escorts provided meant bomber formations could maintain formation discipline, complete bombing runs accurately, and return home with acceptable casualties. German industrial capacity began crumbling under sustained attacks. Oil refineries were bombed repeatedly, fuel production dropped catastrophically, and the fuel shortages further constrained German pilot training and combat operations. Aircraft factories were bombed, reducing production of replacement aircraft. Ball bearing factories were hit, disrupting manufacturing across German industry. The P-51's range made all of this possible. Without escorts, American bombers couldn't sustain the losses required to maintain campaign intensity. With P-51 escorts, the bombing campaign became a sustainable operation that systematically destroyed German war production. It's worth noting what didn't save Germany. The Me-262 jet fighter could outrun P-51s, but it was produced in limited numbers, required extensive maintenance, consumed fuel Germany didn't have, and operated from bases that were themselves targeted by bombers escorted by P-51s. Too little, too late. By summer 1944, the Luftwaffe was effectively defeated as an organized force capable of defending German airspace. German fighters still flew, German pilots still fought. But they did so without realistic hope of stopping American bomber formations. The appearance of P-51s over Berlin in March had marked the beginning of the end for German air defense, but the end itself was brutal and drawn out. Luftwaffe pilot losses in 1944 exceeded 13,000 killed, more than all previous years of the war combined. Experienced pilots who'd survived years of combat were systematically eliminated. The veteran corps that made the Luftwaffe formidable in 1940-1942 was gone by late 1944, replaced by inadequately trained replacements who stood little chance against experienced American pilots in superior aircraft. Here's a statistic that reveals everything. The Luftwaffe scored 80% of its victories on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, but suffered 80% of its losses in the West against American and British forces. The P-51, combined with American tactics and resources, had created a meat grinder that the Luftwaffe couldn't survive. The psychological impact extended beyond pilots to civilians and ground forces. Seeing endless formations of American bombers passing overhead, escorted by fighters that circled protectively, demonstrated German helplessness. The Luftwaffe that had once dominated European skies was now unable to prevent American aircraft from reaching any target in Germany. Adolf Galland later reflected, "The Mustang was the best fighter of the war. Not because it was the fastest, it wasn't. Not because it was the most maneuverable, the Zero and Spitfire could outturn it, but because it could do everything well enough while flying farther than any other fighter. That combination of range, speed, armament, and reliability made it unbeatable." And once the Luftwaffe was broken, the P-51s transitioned to a new role: ground attack. They strafed everything that moved in Germany: trains, trucks, troops, airfields. With air superiority achieved, the P-51s became instruments of systematic destruction, hunting targets of opportunity across the German homeland. March 4, 1944 wasn't just another day in the air war over Europe. It was the day the impossible became reality. The day German pilots looked up and saw their worst nightmare circling at 25,000 feet. The day the calculations that had kept Berlin safe from escorted raids became irrelevant. Hermann Goering, when captured by Allied forces, reportedly said, "As soon as I saw those P-51s over Berlin, I knew it was all over." The P-51 hadn't just extended fighter range. It had eliminated the concept of safe distance. If American bombers could reach a target, P-51 escorts could reach it too. And once P-51s arrived over Berlin, German pilots knew that nowhere in Germany was beyond American reach. That realization, that air superiority was lost, that German airspace couldn't be defended, that the war was being lost from the air, began on March 4, 1944. The day the impossible became reality. The day P-51 Mustangs flew over Berlin. The day German pilots knew they'd lost. March 4, 1944 wasn't just the date American fighters reached Berlin. It was the date the Luftwaffe died. It just took another year for the body to stop moving.